Long eons ago, ages, ages ago, the empire of my race rose proudly above the waves. So long ago was it that no man remembers an ancestor who remembered it. In a great land to the west our cities rose, our golden spires split the stars, our purple-prowed galleys broke the waves around the world, looting the sunset for its treasure and the sunrise for its wealth. Our legions swept forth to the north and to the south, to the west and the east, and none could stand before them. Our cities banded the world. We sent our colonies to all lands to subdue all savages, red, white, or black, and enslave them. They toiled for us in the mines and at the galleys' oars. All over the world, the brown people of Atlantis reigned supreme. We were a sea people, and we delved the deeps of all the oceans. The mysteries were known to us, and the secret things of land and sea and sky. We read the stars and were wise, sons of the sea, we exalted him above all others. We worshipped Valka and Hota, Honen and Golgor. Many virgins, many strong youths died on their altars, and the smoke of the shrines blotted out the sun. Then the sea rose and shook himself. He thundered from his abyss, and the thrones of the world fell before him. New lands rose from the deep, and Atlantis and Mu were swallowed up by the gulf. The green sea roared through the fanes and the castles, and the seaweed encrusted the golden spires and the topaz towers. The empire of Atlantis vanished and was forgotten, passing into the everlasting gulf of time and oblivion. Likewise, the colony cities in barbaric lands, cut off from their mother kingdom, perished. The black savages and the white savages arose and burned and destroyed, until in all the world only the colony city of Negari remained as a symbol of the lost empire. Here my ancestors ruled as kings, and the ancestors of Negari, the she-cat, bent the knee of slavery to them. Years passed, stretching into centuries. The empire of Negari dwindled. Tribe after tribe rose and flung off the chains, pressing the lines back from the sea, until at last the sons of Atlantis gave way entirely and retreated into the city itself, the last stronghold of the race. Conquerors no longer, hemmed in by ferocious tribes, yet they held those tribes at bay for 1,000 years. Negari was invincible from without. Her walls held firm, but within, evil influences were at work. The sons of Atlantis had brought their black slaves into the city with them. The rulers were warriors, scholars, priests, artisans. They did no menial work. For that, they depended upon the slaves. There were more of these slaves than there were masters, and they increased while the brown people dwindled. They mixed with each other more and more as the race degenerated, until at last only the priestcraft was free of the taint of black blood. Rulers sat on the throne of Negari who were nearly pure Negro, and these allowed more and more wild tribesmen to enter the city in the guise of servants, mercenaries, and friends. Then came a day when these fierce slaves revolted and slew all who bore a trace of brown blood, except the priests and their families. These they imprisoned as fetish people. For 1,000 years, black men have ruled in Negari, their kings guided by the captive brown priests, who, though prisoners, were yet the masters of kings. Kane listened enthralled. To his imaginative mind, the tale burned and lived with strange fire from cosmic time and space. After all the sons of Atlantis, save the priests, were dead, there rose a great black king on the defiled throne of ancient Negari. He was a tiger, and his warriors were like leopards. They called themselves Negari, ravishing even the name of their former masters, and none could stand before them. They swept the land from sea to sea, and the smoke of destruction put out the stars. The great river ran red, and the black lords of Negari strode above the corpses of their black foes. Then the great king died, and the black empire crumbled, even as the brown kingdom of Negari had crumbled. They were skilled in war. The dead sons of Atlantis, their masters, had trained them in the ways of battle, and against the wild tribesmen they were invincible. But only in the ways of war had they learned, and the empire was torn with civil strife. Murder and intrigue stalked red-handed through the palaces and the streets, and the boundaries of the empire dwindled and dwindled. All the while, black kings with red, frenzied brains sat on the throne, and behind the curtains, unseen but greatly feared, the brown priests guided the nation, holding it together, keeping it from absolute destruction. Prisoners in the city were we, for there was nowhere else in the world to go. But we moved like ghosts through the secret passages in the walls and under the earth, spying on intrigue and doing secret magic. We upheld the cause of the royal family, the descendants of that tiger-like king of long ago, against all plotting chiefs and grim other tales which these silent walls could tell. For these black people are not as other Negroes. A latent insanity lurks in the brains of every one. They have tasted so deeply and so long of slaughter and victory that they are as human leopards, forever thirsting for blood. On their myriad wretched slaves they have sated all lusts and desires, until they have become foul and terrible beasts, forever seeking some new sensation, forever quenching their fearful thirsts in blood. Like a lion they have lurked in these cages for 1,000 years, to rush forth and ravage the jungle and river people, enslaving and destroying. They are still invincible from without, though their possessions have dwindled to the very walls of this city, and their former great conquests and invasions have dwindled to raids for slaves. But as they faded, so too faded their masters, the brown priests. One by one they died, until only I remained. In the last century they too mixed with their rulers and slaves, and now, oh, black the shame upon me! I, the last son of Atlantis, bear in my veins the taint of Negro blood. They died. I remained, doing magic and guiding the black kings. I, the last brown man of Negari. Then the she-fiend, Nakari, arose. Kane leaned forward with quickened interest. New life surged into the tale as it touched upon his own time. Nakari! The name was spat as a snake hisses. Slave and the daughter of a slave, yet she prevailed when her hour came, and all the royal family died. And me, the last son of Atlantis, me she prisoned and chained. She feared not the silent brown priests, for she was the daughter of a satellite, one of the lesser priests, black men who did the menial work of the brown masters, performing the lesser sacrifices, divining from the livers of fowls and serpents, and keeping the holy fires forever burning. Much she knew of us, and our ways, and evil ambition burned in her. As a child, she danced in the march of the new moon, and as a young girl she was one of the star maidens. Much of the lesser mysteries was known to her, and more she learned, spying upon the secret rites of the priests who enacted hidden rituals that were old when the earth was young. For the remnants of Atlantis secretly kept alive the old worships of Valka and Hota, Honen and Golgor, long forgotten and not to be understood by these black people whose ancestors died screaming on their altars. Alone of all the black, Negari, she feared us not, and she not only overthrew the king and set herself on the throne, but she dominated the priests, the black satellites, and the few brown masters who were left. All these last, save me, died beneath the daggers of her assassins, or on her racks. She alone of all the myriad black thousands who have lived and died between these walls guessed at the hidden passages and subterranean corridors, secrets which we of the priestcraft had guarded jealously from the people for 1,000 years. Ha! Ha! Blind black fools! To pass an ageless age in this city, yet never to learn of the secrets thereof, black apes, fools! Not even the lesser black priests know of the long grey corridors, lit by phosphorescent ceilings, through which, in bygone ages, strange forms have glided silently. For our ancestors built Negari as they built Atlantis, on a mighty scale and with an unknown art. Not for men alone did we build, but for the gods who moved unseen among us. And deep the secrets these ancient walls hold. Torture could not wring these secrets from our lips, but shackled in her dungeons, we trod our hidden corridors no more. For years the dust has gathered there, untouched by human foot, while we, and finally, I alone, lay chained in these foul cells. And among the temples and the dark, mysterious shrines of old, move vile black satellites, elevated by Negari to glories that were once mine, for I am the last Atlantean high priest. Black be their doom, and red be their ruin, Volca and Golgor, gods lost and forgotten, whose memory shall die with me, strike down their walls, and humble them unto the dust. Break the altars of their blind, pagan gods! Kane realized that the man was wandering in his mind. The keen brain had begun to crumble at last. "Tell me," said he. "You mentioned the white girl, Mara. What do you know of her?" "She was brought to Negari years ago by raiders," the other answered, "only a few years after the rise of the Black Queen, whose slave she is. Little of her I know, for shortly after her arrival Negari turned on me, and the years that lie between have been grim black years, shot red with torture and agony. Here I have lain, hampered by my chains from escape which lay in that door through which you entered, and for the knowledge of which Negari has torn me on racks, and suspended me over slow fires." Kane shuddered. "You know not if they have so misused the white girl? Her eyes are haunted, and she has wasted away." "She has danced with the star maidens at Negari's command, and has looked on the bloody and terrible rites of the Black Temple. She has lived for years among a people with whom blood is cheaper than water, who delight in slaughter and foul torture, and such sights as she has looked upon would blast the eyes and wither the flesh of strong men." She has seen the victims of Nakura die amid horrid torments, and the sight is burned forever in the brain of the beholder. The rites of the Atlanteans the blacks took, whereby to honor their crude gods. And though the essence of those rites is lost in the wasting years, yet even as Negari's black apes perform them, they are not such as men can look on unshaken. Kane was thinking. A fair day for the world when this Atlantis sank, for most certainly it bred a race of strange and unknown evil. Aloud he said, "Who is this master of whom Negari spake? And what meant she by calling Mara his bride?" "Nakura, Nakura! The skull of evil, the symbol of death that they worship. What know these savages of the gods of sea-girt Atlantis? What know they of the dread and unseen gods whom their masters worshipped with majestic and mysterious rites? They understand not of the unseen essence, the invisible deity that reigns in the air and the elements. They must worship a material object, endowed with human shape. Nakura was the last great wizard of Atlantean Negari. A brown renegade he was, who conspired against his own people and aided the revolt of the black beasts. In life they followed him, and in death they defied him. High in the tower of death his fleshless skull is set, and on that skull hinge the brains of all the people of Negari. Nay, we of Atlantis worshipped death, but we likewise worshipped life. These people worship only death, and call themselves sons of death, and the skull of Nakura has been to them for 1,000 years, the symbol of their power, the evidence of their greatness." "Do you mean," Kane broke in impatiently on these ramblings, "that they will sacrifice the girl to their god?" "In the moon of skulls she will die on the black altar." "What in God's name is this moon of skulls?" Kane cried passionately. "The full moon. At the full of each moon, which we name the moon of skulls, a virgin dies on the black altar before the Tower of Death, where centuries ago virgins died in honor of Golgor, the god of Atlantis. Now, from the face of the tower that once housed the glory of Golgor, leers down the skull of the renegade wizard, and the people believe that his brain still lives therein to guide the star of the city. For look ye, stranger, when the full moon gleams over the rim of the tower, and the chant of the priests falls silent, then from the skull of Nakura thunders a great voice, raised in an ancient Atlantean chant, and the black people fall on their faces before it. But hark, there is a secret way, a stair leading up to a hidden niche behind the skull, and there a priest lurks and chants. In days gone by, one of the sons of Atlantis had this office, and by all rights of men and gods it should be mine this day. For though we sons of Atlantis worshipped our ancient gods in secret, the black people would have none of them, and to hold our power we were devotees to their foul gods, and we sang and sacrificed to him whose memory we cursed. But Negari discovered the secret, known before only to the brown priests, and now one of her black satellites mounts the hidden stair, and yammers forth a strange and terrible chant, which is but meaningless gibberish to him as to those who hear it. I, and only I, know its grim and fearful meaning." Kane's brain whirled in his efforts to formulate some plan of action. For the first time during the whole search for the girl, he felt himself against a blank wall. The palace was a labyrinth, a maze in which he could decide no direction. The corridors seemed to run without plan or purpose, and how could he find Marilyn, prisoned as she doubtless was in one of the myriad chambers or cells? Or had she already passed over the borderline of life, or succumbed to the brutal torture lust of Negari? He scarcely heard the ravings and mutterings of the dying man. "Stranger, do you indeed live, or are you but one of the ghosts which have haunted me of late, stealing through the darkness of my cell? Nay, you are flesh and blood, but you are a white savage, as Negari's race are black savages. Eons ago, when your ancestors were defending their caves against the tiger and the mammoth with crude spears of flint, the gold spires of my people split the stars. They are gone and forgotten, and the world is a waste of barbarians, black and white. Let me, too, pass as a dream that is forgotten in the mists of the ages." Kane rose and paced the cell. His fingers closed like steel talons, as on a sword hilt, and a blind red wave of fury surged through his brain. Oh, God! To get his foes before the keen blade that had been taken from him, to face the whole city, one man against them all. Kane pressed his hands against his temples. The moon was nearly full when I last saw it, but I know not how long ago that was. I know not how long I have been in this accursed place, or how long I lay in that dungeon where Negari threw me. The time of full moon may be past, and, oh merciful God, Marilyn may be dead already. "Tonight is the moon of skulls," muttered the other. "I heard one of my jailers speak it." Kane gripped the dying man's shoulder with unconscious force. "If you hate Negari or love mankind, in God's name tell me how to save the child." "Love mankind?" The priest laughed insanely. "What has a son of Atlantis and a priest of forgotten Golgor to do with love? What are mortals but food for the jaws of the black gods? Softer girls than your Mara have died screaming beneath these hands, and my heart was as iron to their cries. Yet hate—" The strange eyes flamed with fearful light. "For hate, I will tell you what you wish to know. Go to the Tower of Death when the moon is risen, slay the black priest who lurks behind the skull of Nakura, and then, when the chanting of the worshippers below ceases, and the masked slayer beside the black altar rises the sacrificial dagger, speak in a loud voice that the people can understand, bidding them set free the victim, and offer up instead Negari, Queen of Negari. As for the rest, afterward you must rely on your own craft and prowess, if you come free." Kane shook him. "Swift, tell me how I am to reach this tower." "Go back through the door whence you came." The man was sinking fast. His words dropped to whispers. "Turn to the left, and go 100 paces. Mount the stair you come to, as high as it goes. In the corridor where it ceases, go straight for another 100 paces, and when you come to what seems a blank wall, feel over it until you find a projecting spring. Press this, and enter the door which will open. You will then be out of the palace, and in the cliffs against which it is built, and in the only one of the secret corridors known to the people of Negari. Turn to your right, and go straight down the passage for 500 paces. There you will come to a stair which leads up to the niche behind the skull. The Tower of Death is built into the cliff and projects above it. There are 2 stairs." Suddenly, the voice trailed out. Kane leaned forward and shook the man, But he suddenly rose up with a great effort. His eyes blazed with a wild and unearthly light, and he flung his shackled arms wide. "The sea!" he cried in a great voice. "The golden spires of Atlantis, and the sun on the deep blue waters! I come!" And as Kane reached to lay him down again, he slumped back, dead. Chapter 6. The Shattering of the Skull. By thought a crawling ruin, by life a leaping mire, by a broken heart in the breast of the world, and the end of the world's desire. Chesterton. Kane wiped the cold sweat from his pale brow as he hurried down the shadowy passage. Outside this horrible palace it must be night. Even now the full moon, the grim moon of skulls, might be rising above the horizon. He paced off 100 paces, and came upon the stair the dying priest had mentioned. This he mounted, and coming into the corridor above, he measured off another 100 paces, and brought up short against what appeared to be a doorless wall. It seemed an age before his frantic fingers found a piece of projecting metal. There was a creak of rusty hinges as the hidden door swung open, and Kane looked into a passageway darker than the one in which he stood. He entered, and when the door shut behind him, he turned to his right and groped his way along for 500 paces. There the corridor was lighter. Light sifted in from without, and Kane discerned a stairway. Up this he went for several steps, then halted, baffled. At a sort of landing the stairway became two, one leading away to the left, the other to the right. Kane cursed. He felt that he could not afford to make a mistake. Time was too precious. But how was he to know which would lead him to the niche where the priest hid? The Atlantean had been about to tell him of these stairs when struck by the delirium which precedes death, and Kane wished fervently that he had lived only a few moments longer. At any rate, he had no time to waste. Right or wrong, he must chance it. He chose the right-hand stair and ran swiftly up it. No time for caution now. He felt instinctively that the time of the sacrifice was close at hand. He came into another passage, and discerned by the change in masonry that he was out of the cliffs again, and in some building, presumably the Tower of Death. He expected any moment to come upon another stair, and suddenly his expectations were realized. But instead of up, it led down. From somewhere in front of him, Kane heard a vague, rhythmic murmur, and a cold hand gripped his heart, the chanting of the worshippers before the black altar. He raced forward recklessly, rounded a turn in the corridor, brought up short against a door, and looked through a tiny aperture. His heart sank. He had chosen the wrong stair, and had wandered into some other building adjoining the Tower of Death. He looked upon a grim and terrible scene. In a wide-open space before a great black tower, whose spire rose above the crags behind it, two long lines of black dancers swayed and writhed. Their voices rose in a strange, meaningless chant, and they did not move from their tracks. From their knees upward, their bodies swayed in fantastic, rhythmical motions, and in their hands torches tossed and whirled, shedding a lurid, shifting red light over the scene. Behind them were ranged a vast concourse of people who stood silent. The dancing torchlight gleamed on a sea of glittering eyes and black faces. In front of the dancers rose the Tower of Death, gigantically tall, black, and horrific. No door or window opened in its face, but high on the wall, in a sort of ornamented frame, there leered a grim symbol of death and decay. The skull of Nakura. A faint, eerie glow surrounded it, lit somehow from within the tower, Kane knew, and wondered by what strange art the priests had kept the skull from decay and dissolution so long. But it was neither the skull nor the tower which gripped the Puritan's horrified gaze and held it. Between the converging lines of yelling, swaying worshippers, there rose a great black altar. On this altar lay a slim white shape. "Marilyn!" The word burst from Kane's lips in a great sob. For a moment he stood frozen, helpless, struck blind. No time now to retrace his steps and find the niche where the skull priest lurked. Even now a faint glow was apparent behind the spire of the tower, etching that spire blackly against the sky. The moon had risen. The chant of the dancers soared up to a frenzy of sound, and from the silent watchers behind them began a sinister low rumble of drums. To Kane's dazed mind, it seemed that he looked on some red debauch of a lower hell. What ghastly worship of past eons did these perverted and degenerate rites symbolize? Kane knew that these black people aped the rituals of their former masters in their crude way, and even in his despair he found time to shudder at the thought of what those original rites must have been. Now, a fearful shape rose up behind the altar where lay the silent girl. A tall black man, entirely naked save for a hideous painted mask on his face and a great headdress of waving plumes. The drone of the chant sank low for an instant, then rose up again to wilder heights. Was it the vibrations of their song that made the floor quiver beneath Kane's feet? Kane, with shaking fingers, began to unbar the door. Naught to do now but to rush out bare-handed and die beside the girl he could not save. Then his gaze was blocked by a giant form which shouldered in front of the door. A huge black man, a chief by his bearing and apparel, leaned idly against the wall as he watched the proceedings. Kane's heart gave a great leap. This was too good to be true. Thrust in the black man's girdle was the pistol he himself had carried. He knew that his weapons must have been divided among his captors. The pistol meant nothing to the chief, but he must have been taken by its strange shape, and was carrying it as savages will wear useless trinkets, or perhaps he thought it a sort of war club. At any rate, there it was. And again, floor and building seemed to tremble. Kane pulled the door silently inward and crouched in the shadows behind his victim like a great brooding tiger. His brain worked swiftly and formulated his plan of action. There was a dagger in the girdle beside the pistol. The black man's back was turned squarely to him, and he must strike from the left to reach the heart and silence him quickly. All this passed through Solomon's brain in a flash as he crouched. The black man was not aware of his foe's presence until Kane's lean right hand shot across his shoulder and clamped on his mouth, jerking him backward. At the same instant, the Puritan's left hand tore the dagger from the girdle, and with one desperate plunge sank the keen blade home. The black crumpled without a sound, and in an instant Kane's pistol was in its owner's hand. A second's investigation showed that it was still loaded and the flint still in place. No one had seen the swift murder. Those few who stood near the doorway were all facing the black altar, enwrapped in the drama which was there unfolding, As Kane stepped across the corpse, the chanting of the dancers ceased. Abruptly, in the instants of silence which followed, Kane heard, above the pounding of his own pulse, the night wind rustle the death-like plumes of the masked horror beside the altar. A rim of the moon glowed above the spire. Then from high up, on the face of the Tower of Death, a deep voice boomed out in a strange chant. Mayhap the black priest who spoke behind the skull knew not what his words meant, but Kane believed that he at least mimicked the very intonation of those long-dead brown acolytes. Deep, mystic, resonant, the voice sounded out, like the endless flowing of long tides on the broad white beaches. The masked one beside the altar drew himself up to his great height, and raised a long, glimmering blade. Kane recognized his own sword, even as he leveled his pistol and fired, not at the masked priest, but full at the skull which gleamed in the face of the tower. For in one blinding flash of intuition, he remembered the dying Atlantean's words, "Their brains hinge on the skull of Nakura." Simultaneously, with the crack of the pistol, came a shattering crash. The dry skull flew into 1,000 pieces and vanished, and behind it, the chant broke off short in a death shriek. The rapier fell from the hand of the masked priest, and many of the dancers crumpled to the earth, the others halting short, spellbound. Through the deathly silence which reigned for an instant, Kane rushed toward the altar. Then all hell broke loose. A babel of bestial screams rose to the shuddering stars. For centuries, only their faith in the dead Nakura had held together the blood-drenched brains of the black Negari. Now their symbol had vanished, had been blasted into nothing before their eyes. It was to them as if the skies had split, the moon fallen, and the world ended. All the red visions which lurked at the backs of their corroded brains leaped into fearful life. All the latent insanity which was their heritage rose to claim its own, and Kane looked upon a whole nation turned to bellowing maniacs. Screaming and roaring, they turned on each other, men and women, tearing with frenzied fingernails, stabbing with spears and daggers, beating each other with the flaming torches, while over all rose the roar of frantic human beasts. With clubbed pistol, Kane battered his way through the surging, writhing ocean of flesh to the foot of the altar stairs. Nails raked him, knives slashed at him, torches scorched his garments, but he paid no heed. Then, as he reached the altar, a terrible figure broke from the struggling mass and charged him. Nakari, Queen of Negari, crazed as any of her subjects, rushed upon the white man with dagger bared and eyes horribly aflame. "You shall not escape this time, white man!" she was screaming. But before she reached him, a great black giant, dripping blood and blind from a gash across his eyes, reeled across her path and lurched into her. She screamed like a wounded cat and struck her dagger into him, and then the groping hands closed on her. The blind giant whirled her on high with one dying effort, and her last scream knifed the din of battle as Nakari, last queen of Negari, crashed against the stones of the altar and fell shattered and dead at Kane's feet. Kane sprang up the black steps, borne deep by the feet of myriad priests and victims, and as he came, the masked figure, who had stood like one turned to stone, came suddenly to life. He bent swiftly, caught up the sword he had dropped, and thrust savagely at the charging white man. but the dynamic quickness of Solomon Kane was such as few men could match. A twist and sway of his steely body, and he was inside the thrust, and as the blade slid harmlessly between arm and chest, he brought down the heavy pistol barrel among the waving plumes, crashing headdress, mask, and skull with one blow. Then, ere he turned to the fainting girl who lay bound on the altar, he flung aside the shattered pistol and snatched his stolen sword from the nerveless hand which still grasped it, feeling a fierce thrill of renewed confidence at the familiar feel of the hilt. Marilyn lay white and silent, her death-like face turned blindly to the light of the moon which shone calmly down on the frenzied scene. At first, Kane thought her to be dead, but his searching fingers detected a faint flutter of pulse. He cut her bonds and lifted her tenderly, only to drop her again and whirl as a hideous blood-stained figure of insanity came leaping and gibbering up the steps. Full upon Kane's outthrust blade the creature ran, and toppled back into the red swirl below, clawing beast-like at its mortal wound. Then, beneath Kane's feet, the altar rocked. A sudden tremor hurled him to his knees, and his horrified eyes beheld the Tower of Death sway to and fro. Some horror of nature was taking place, and this fact pierced the crumbling brains of the fiends who fought and screamed below. A new element entered into their shrieking, and then the Tower of Death swayed far out with a terrible and awesome majesty, broke from the rocking crags, and gave way with a thunder of crashing worlds. Great stones and shards of masonry came raining down, bringing death and destruction to hundreds of screaming humans below. One of these stones crashed to pieces on the altar beside Kane, showering him with dust. "Earthquake!" he gasped, and smitten by this new terror, he caught up the senseless girl and plunged recklessly down the cracking steps, hacking and stabbing away through the crimson whirlpools of bestial humanity that still tore and ravened. The rest was a red nightmare in which Kane's dazed brain refused to record all its horrors. It seemed that for screaming crimson centuries he reeled through narrow, winding streets where bellowing, screeching black demons battled and died among titanic walls and black columns that rocked against the sky and crashed to ruin about him, while the earth heaved and trembled beneath his staggering feet, and the thunder of crashing towers filled the world. Gibbering fiends in human shape clutched and clawed at him, to fade before his flailing sword, and falling stones bruised and battered him. He crouched as he reeled along, covering the girl with his body as best he could, sheltering her alike from blind stone and blinder human. And at last, when it seemed mortal endurance had reached its limit, he saw the great black outer wall of the city loom before him, rent from earth to parapet, and tottering for its fall. He dashed through a crevice, and gathering his efforts, made one last sprint, and scarce was he out of reach than the wall crashed, falling inward like a great black wave. The night wind was in his face, and behind him rose the clamor of the doomed city as Kane staggered down the hill path that trembled beneath his feet. Chapter 7. The Faith of Solomon. The last lost giant, even God, is risen against the world. Chesterton. Dawn lay like a cool white hand on the brow of Solomon Kane. The nightmares faded from his soul, as he breathed deep of the morning wind which blew up from the jungle far below his feet, a wind laden with the musk of decaying vegetation. Yet it was like the breath of life to him, for the scents were those of the clean, natural disintegration of outdoor things, not the loathsome aura of decadent antiquity that lurks in the walls of eon-old cities. Kane shuddered, involuntarily. He bent over the sleeping girl who lay at his feet, arranged as comfortably as possible with the few soft tree branches he had been able to find for her bed. Now she opened her eyes and stared about wildly for an instant. Then, as her gaze met the face of Solomon, lighted by one of his rare smiles, she gave a little sob of thankfulness and clung to him. "Oh, Captain Kane, have we in truth escaped from yon fearful city? Now it seems all like a dream. After you fell through the secret door in my chamber, Negari later went to your dungeon, as she told me, and returned in a vile humour. She said you were a fool, for she had offered you the kingdom of the world, and you had but insulted her. She screamed and raved and cursed like one insane, and swore that she would yet alone build a great empire of Negari. Then she turned on me and reviled me, saying that you held me a slave, in more esteem than a queen and all her glory, and in spite of my pleas she took me across her knee and whipped me until I swooned. Afterward, I lay half senseless for a long time, and was only dimly aware that men came to Negari and said that you had escaped. They said you were a sorcerer, for you faded through a solid wall like a ghost. But Negari killed the men who had brought you from the cell, and for hours she was like a wild beast. How long I lay thus, I know not. In those terrible rooms and corridors where no natural sunlight ever entered, one lost all track of time. But from the time you were captured by Negari, and the time that I was placed on the altar, at least a day and a night, and another day must have passed. It was only a few hours before the sacrifice that word came you had escaped. Negari and her star maidens came to prepare me for the rite. At the bare memory of that fearful ordeal, she whimpered and hid her face in her hands. I must have been drugged. I only know that they clothed me in the white robe of the sacrifice and carried me into a great black chamber filled with horrid statues. There I lay for a space, like one in a trance, while the women performed various strange and shameful rites according to their grim religion. Then I fell into a swoon, and when I emerged I was lying bound on the black altar. The torches were tossing, and the devotees chanting. Behind the Tower of Death the rising moon was beginning to glow. All this I knew faintly, as in a deep dream. And as in a dream, I saw the glowing skull high on the tower, and the gaunt, black, naked priest holding a sword above my heart. Then I knew no more. What happened? At about that moment, Kane answered, I emerged from a building wherein I had wandered by mistake, and blasted their hellish skull to atoms with a pistol ball. Whereupon all these people, being cursed from birth by demons, and being likewise possessed of devils, fall to slaying one another. And in the midst of the tumult an earthquake cometh to pass, which shakes the walls down. Then I snatch you up, and running at random come upon a rent in the outer wall, and thereby escape, carrying you, who seem in a swoon. Once only you awoke, after I had crossed the bridge across the sky, as the black people called it, which was crumbling beneath our feet by reason of the earthquake. After I had come to these cliffs, but dared not descend them in the darkness, the moon being nigh to setting by that time, you awoke and screamed and clung to me, whereupon I soothed you as best I might, and after a time you fell into a natural sleep."
"And now what?"
asked the girl. "England." Kane's deep eyes lighted at the word. "I find it hard to remain in the land of my birth for more than a month at a time. Yet, though I am cursed with the wanderlust, 'tis a name which ever rouses a glow in my bosom. And how of you, child?"
"Oh, heaven!"
she cried, clasping her small hands.
"Home! Something of which to be dreamed, never attained, I fear. Oh, Captain Kane, how shall we gain through all the vast leagues of jungle which lie between this place and the coast?"
"Marilyn," said Kane gently, stroking her curly hair, "methinks you lack somewhat in faith, both in Providence and in me. Nay, alone I am a weak creature, having no strength or might in me. Yet in times past hath God made me a great vessel of wrath and a sword of deliverance, and, I trust, shall do so again. Look you, little Marilyn, in the last few hours, as it were, we have seen the passing of an evil race and the fall of a foul black empire. Men died by thousands about us, and the earth rose beneath our feet, hurling down towers that broke the heavens, yea, death fell about us in a red rain, yet we escaped unscathed. Therein is more than the hand of man, nay, a power, the mightiest power, that which guided me across the world, straight to that demon city, which led me to your chamber, which aided me to escape again, and led me to the one man in all the city who would give the information I must have, the strange evil priest of an elder race who lay dying in a subterranean cell, and which guided me to the outer wall as I ran blindly and at random, for should I have come under the cliffs which formed the rest of the wall, we had surely perished. That same power brought us safely out of the dying city, and safe across the rocking bridge, which shattered and thundered down into the chasm just as my feet touched solid earth. Think you that having led me this far and accomplished such wonders, the power will strike us down now? Nay! Evil flourishes and rules in the cities of men and the waste places of the world. But anon, the great giant that is God rises and smites for the righteous, and they lay faith on him. I say this cliff shall we descend in safety, and yon dank jungle traverse in safety, and it is as sure that in old Devon your people shall clasp you again to their bosom as that you stand here. And now, for the first time, Marilyn smiled, with the quick eagerness of a normal young girl, and Kane sighed in relief. Already the ghosts were fading from her haunted eyes, and Kane looked to the day when her horrible experiences should be as a dimming dream. One glance he flung behind him, where beyond the scowling hills the lost city of Negari lay shattered and silent, amid the ruins of her own walls and the fallen crags which had kept her invincible so long, but which had, at last, betrayed her to her doom. A momentary pang smote him as he thought of the myriad of crushed, still forms lying amid those ruins. Then the blasting memory of their evil crimes surged over him, and his eyes hardened. And it shall come to pass that he who fleeth from the noise of the fear shall fall into the pit, and he that cometh up out of the midst of the pit shall be taken in the snare, for the windows from on high are open, and the foundations of the earth do shake. For thou hast made of a city an heap, of a defended city, a ruin, a palace of strangers to be no city, it shall never be built. Moreover, the multitude of thy strangers shall be like small dust, and the multitude of the terrible ones shall be as chaff that passeth suddenly away, yea, it shall be at an instant, suddenly. Stay yourselves and wonder. Cry ye out and cry. They are drunken, but not with wine. They stagger, but not with strong drink. Verily, Marilyn, said Kane with a sigh, with mine own eyes have I seen the prophecies of Isaiah come to pass. They were drunken, but not with wine. Nay, blood was their drink, and in that red flood they dipped deep and terribly. Then, taking the girl by the hand, he started toward the edge of the cliff. At this very point had he ascended in the night. How long ago it seemed! Kane's clothing hung in tatters about him. He was torn, scratched, and bruised, but in his eyes shone the clear, calm light of serenity as the sun came up, flooding cliffs and jungle with a golden light that was like a promise of joy and happiness.